Hi, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be doing a supply and demand review video to reinforce the concepts that we covered in chapter 3 when we learned about supply and demand. First off, we're going to start with the demand side, and one key thing that I really want us to know here is to be able to differentiate between demand and quantity demanded. Knowing the difference between these two definitions will help us to understand the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded later on. So I've wrote our two definitions here, and we have demand, which is the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. And then our next definition is quantity demanded, which is the total number of units of a good or service that consumers are willing to purchase at a given price or a specific price. And we can show the difference between these two definitions looking at our demand curve. So at the bottom here, I've drawn a graph of our demand curve, and we always want to label our axes when we're drawing a graph. So on the x-axis, we'll always have quantity, and on the y-axis, we'll always have price. And so from the law of demand, we know that our demand curve is downward sloping, and we label our demand curve as D. So when we're talking about demand, what we're really looking at is our entire demand curve. So the entire demand curve is telling us the quantity of that good or service that consumers are willing to purchase at each price. You know, the price at this level, this level, this level, this level. Because the demand curve is a straight line, it's telling us the quantity that consumers are willing to purchase at every single price. The difference here is that quantity demanded is the total number of units of a good that consumers are willing to purchase at a specific price. So let's say the price was up here at $7, then our quantity demanded would be given to us by this point. So let's say that's maybe 4 units. Whereas if our price was down here at, let's say, $5, our quantity demanded would be here at, let's say, 6 units. So the difference is that quantity demanded is the amount that consumers want to buy at a specific price, while demand is just telling us the quantity that consumers want at any price, at each possible price. All right, so the reason that we want to be able to distinguish between demand and quantity demanded is so that we can understand the different effects that result from a change in price or a change in one of these shift factors that we talked about in the demand video. So as we know from the law of demand tells us that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. And this is just a little shorthand note to represent that for us. So the law of demand tells us that when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And so this is what we're going to use to understand what happens to quantity demanded when there's a change in price. So let's say that our original price was up here at $10, and our quantity demanded at this price of $10 is, say, 6 units of this good. Now, we want to know what happens when the price drops to $8. So from the law of demand, we know that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. And so we can also reverse this relationship. So when the price goes down, the quantity demanded should go up. And this is pretty intuitive. This would be, what you or I might choose to do if a product that we like goes on sale. If it goes on sale and the price goes down, we might choose to buy more of it. So in this case, we saw that the price dropped, and we see that our quantity demanded for this good will increase to, let's say, 8 units. So the key takeaway here is that a change in price is going to result in a change in the quantity demanded. So the important thing to note here is that a change in price does not shift the demand curve. A change in price only causes us to move along the demand curve to a new point on that same demand curve. So just keep in mind that when we have a change in price, we're talking about the law of demand. And the law of demand tells us that a change in price will cause a change in quantity demanded. All right, so we've talked about how a change in price impacts our demand, and we know that a change in price only causes a movement along the demand curve. A change in price does not shift the demand curve. So now we want to talk about changes in factors other than the price. And so these are our demand shifters. And I've listed them here on the right. These are the same shifters that we covered in the demand video. But essentially, the big difference to know here is that when we have a change in a factor other than price, that's when we expect a shift in the demand curve. And these five factors listed here are the only changes that will shift the demand curve. If we have a change in something that's not on this list, the demand curve won't shift. And if we have a change in price, we know that we'll be moving along the demand curve as we did before. So as we said before, we'll do a simple example here. If the number of buyers in the market increases, this means that there's more consumers. And what that means is that at every given price, there's going to be more demand because there's more people that want to buy that product. So what we'll see is our demand curve will shift outwards and we'll end up at this new demand curve. We'll go over some more examples when we put these all together and do some supply and demand practice problems. All right, so just as we did with demand, we're now going to move on to the supply side. And we're going to start by looking at the definition of supply and of quantity supplied. So, supply is the amount of a good or service that producers are willing and able to supply or to sell at each price, at every possible price. While quantity supplied is the total number of units of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at a given price or a specific price. So to show the difference here, we'll go to our graph. And remember, we always want to label our axes. So quantity will be on the x-axis and price will be on the y-axis. And because of the law of supply, which I'll abbreviate down here, the law of supply tells us that if price increases, our quantity supplied will also increase. So we know that our supply curve will slope upwards, and we'll label it with an S. So to differentiate between the definition of supply and quantity supplied, supply is telling us the amount that producers are willing to sell at every price. So supply is really just our entire supply curve, any point along the supply curve. While quantity supplied is the total number of units that of a good that producers are willing to sell at a specific price or a given price. So our quantity supplied will represent just an individual point somewhere along our supply curve. So to illustrate quantity supplied, let's say that our price was here at $4, and at a price of $4, the quantity supplied is given by this point, and our quantity supplied is, let's say, 6 units. Okay, so now that we've talked about the difference between supply and quantity supplied, we're going to look at what happens when there's a change in price. So let's first suppose that the price is here at, let's say, $2. And at this price, our quantity supplied is 3 units. Now we want to know what happens when the price increases to $4. So we have a price increase to $4. And according to the law of supply, we know that when the price increases, the quantity supplied will increase as well. And that's shown here on our graph. And we see that the new quantity supplied at this higher price is larger. And we can say that that's maybe 7 units. So what we see here is that when there's a change in price, there's no shift in our supply curve. Instead, we're moving along the supply curve to a new point on that same curve. So whenever there's a change in price, we have a change in the quantity supplied. All right, so now that we've talked about how a change in price causes a change in the quantity supplied, we want to look at what factors can change that would cause a shift in the supply curve. And so I've listed here on the right all of those factors that can shift the supply curve. So whenever we see an event that is related to one of these events, we would see a shift in the supply curve. When there's a change in price, there will be no shift in the supply curve. When there's an event that occurs that's not included in one of these four, then there would be no shift in the supply curve. So let's do a quick example here. Let's say that we're looking at the market for burgers. So I'll just label our graph here. And let's say that the price of hamburger buns went up. So the price of hamburger buns has gone up. Hamburger buns are an input for producing hamburgers. And what this tells us is essentially that burger production has gotten more expensive. So when it becomes more expensive to produce burgers, because we have this increase in input prices, we know that our supply curve will shift to the left. So there is a decrease in supply because production has become more expensive, so producers will choose to produce less at every given price. Now, something that can be confusing here is that when there's a decrease in supply, the supply curve shifts to the left. And I know this can look a little weird because it looks like our new supply is kind of above our old supply. But what we need to keep in mind is that on the x-axis, we're looking at quantity. Smaller quantities are to the left, and larger quantities are to the right. So when we have a decrease in supply, our supply curve needs to shift to the left to represent a smaller quantity at every given price. So just to reiterate with this example, when the price of hamburger buns increases, that's a change in the input price for burgers. Burger production becomes more expensive. Producers want to supply less at every given price, so the supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, so now to cap off our review video, we're going to talk about equilibrium. So here I've drawn a graph that combines both our demand and supply curve onto one graph. And our equilibrium point will always be the point at which the demand curve and supply curve intersect. And this is what we consider to be the most efficient point in the market. And this is because it's the point at which buyers and sellers agree. So at this equilibrium point where the supply and demand curve intersect, the market has an equilibrium price. And this is the price at which the quantity demanded by consumers is equal to the quantity supplied by producers. And so this would be our equilibrium quantity. All right, now just to give us some practice, we're going to go through the problems from the supply and demand worksheet together, look at how these events are shifting our supply and demand curves, and determine their effect on equilibrium. So starting with our first problem, we're trying to understand the effect of a new console becoming more popular in the market for video game consoles. So first, we always want to start out by drawing our original supply and demand curves and our original equilibrium. So we'll label our curves here. Remember, demand is always downward sloping. And this intersection of our supply and demand is giving us our equilibrium. So this is our original equilibrium quantity. And this is our original equilibrium price. Now, when the video game console becomes more popular, we interpret this as a positive change in consumer tastes. So when consumer tastes move towards buying a product, the product becomes more popular. We expect that more people will want to purchase the product, and therefore we expect demand to increase. And when demand increases, we can illustrate that as our demand curve shifting to the right. So let's go ahead and show that on our graph. We can also add in some arrows just to show the direction of our shift. And don't forget to label the new demand curve as well. So now that we've shown our demand curve shift, we want to identify our new equilibrium point. So our new equilibrium will be here, where our new demand curve is intersecting the supply. And this will give us our new equilibrium quantity and our new equilibrium price. And the last thing we learn here is that our equilibrium price has increased and our equilibrium quantity has also increased. So just to give an overview with this problem, when the video game console becomes more popular, this is a positive shift in consumer tastes. This will cause an increase in demand, which we illustrate on our graph by shifting our demand curve to the right. After we identify our new equilibrium point, we see that our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price have both increased. All right, next, let's look at the market for soybeans. So again, we're going to draw our original supply and demand curves and our original equilibrium. As always, this intersection will be our equilibrium, and it gives us our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. So this event is pretty straightforward. It's telling us right in the wording that the supply of soybeans is going to decrease. So because of this natural disaster, the supply of soybeans will decrease. And we illustrate this as a leftward shift of the supply curve. We'll show that on our graph. And label our curve. Now we'll identify our new equilibrium point, which is the point here where our new supply intersects our demand. And we label our new equilibrium quantity and our new equilibrium price. And what we learn here is that our equilibrium price has increased, but our equilibrium quantity has decreased. And just a reminder, with the supply curve, our shift to the left is representing a decrease because on our x-axis for quantity, smaller quantities are to the left and larger quantities are to the right. All right, now we're moving on to number 3. And in number 3, there are actually 2 events occurring at the same time. And so whenever we have a problem where there's 2 events presented as a supply and demand shift, we want to split those events into their respective pieces and look at them one by one. So again, we're just setting up our original graph. And the first event that we're going to look at is what happens when a new health trend increases the popularity of organic foods. So kind of like in the first problem, we're seeing an increase in the popularity of this good. And so we interpret that as a positive change in consumer taste. So this means that our demand for organic foods is going to increase. And as always, we show this increase in demand as a rightward shift of the demand curve. All right, so that's our first event. Now let's move on to the second event. And the second event is again very straightforward, kind of like problem 2. A drought is going to decrease the supply of organic foods. So we know that our supply will decrease. And we'll show this as a leftward shift on our graph. All right, and now our next step here is we want to see what is the impact on equilibrium when we have these two shifts occur at the same time. So first, we'll talk about equilibrium price. That's sort of the easy one here. So when our demand curve shifted to the right, we've kind of moved upwards in terms of price to this, intermediate equilibrium. So if we had only shifted our demand curve, our equilibrium would have been here and our price would have been higher. After we shifted the supply curve as well, we end up at this equilibrium point, and we see that our equilibrium price is indeed higher. So in this example, we can say without a doubt, our equilibrium price has increased. All right, now let's talk about equilibrium quantity. So when we shifted our demand curve to the right to represent our increase in demand, our equilibrium quantity increased a little bit at this intermediate equilibrium. But when our supply decreased, our equilibrium quantity shifted backwards. So because we have these competing effects, the shift in demand is pushing the equilibrium quantity higher, while the shift in supply is pushing the equilibrium quantity lower. Without any data, it's impossible for us to know what actually happened to the equilibrium quantity. So normally in this case, we would say that the equilibrium quantity is undetermined. So depending on how far I drew these curves when I shifted them, if I had drawn the supply curve to shift out even further or it to shift much less, that could change where our final equilibrium point ended up. So in that case, we'll just leave it at this and say, hey, we're not sure what the equilibrium quantity is. It could be larger than it was before, and it could be smaller than it was before. Okay, moving on to problem 4, we're looking at the market for winter coats. And we want to see what happens when an unusually warm winter decreases the demand for winter coats. So this event is worded pretty straightforward. It's telling us that the demand is going to decrease. And this is kind of a consumer tastes event. So because of, the weather is warmer, not as many people need winter coats, consumers are not choosing to buy as many winter coats. And so for this reason, our demand will decrease, which means our demand curve will shift to the left. And again, we'll show that on our graph. And now we want to identify our new equilibrium point, which will be here, where our new demand curve intersects the supply curve. And this new equilibrium will give us our new equilibrium quantity and our new equilibrium price. Lastly, we see that our equilibrium price has decreased and our equilibrium quantity has also decreased. All right, our last example for today is looking at the market for electric vehicles. And this problem is asking us to determine what would be the effect of a new technology that improves the production of electric vehicles. So when this new technology comes out that improves the production of electric vehicles, we know that this is a shifter for the supply curve. So our supply will increase. And we'll show this as a shift right in the supply curve. And remember, this is because for both supply and demand, shifts to the right represent an increase, and shifts to the left represent a decrease. So here's our new supply curve. And now we look for our new equilibrium point, which is where our new supply intersects the demand. And we use this to identify our new equilibrium quantity and our new equilibrium price. And so we see that our equilibrium price has decreased, but our equilibrium quantity has increased. All right, that's all for this video. If you have any questions or if you want me to make you some more practice problems, please just reach out to me over email. I'm happy to, create more practice problems or go over existing examples with you. Whatever you guys need to feel prepared for the exam, I'm here to provide that for you. All right, thank you.